In modern political discourse, hyperbole has become the mother tongue of power. No longer satisfied with the plain, procedural language of governance, politicians now speak in the grandiose, the exaggerated, and the absurd. It's not enough to say, "We disagree with another nation's policy." They must say, "We will respond like no one has ever responded before," as if diplomacy were a shouting contest at a sports arena rather than a measured exchange between sovereign states. Hyperbolic language in politics serves multiple functions. Primarily, it creates spectacle. Leaders, especially those groomed in media-centric cultures, understand that bold, over-the-top declarations cut through the noise. They don't aim to persuade with nuance, they aim to dominate the conversation with volume and shock value. This approach isn't just about making a statement, it's about being the statement, being the headline, the trending topic, the meme, the viral sensation. The use of hyperbole also works as a form of distraction. While the people concern themselves with the outrageous phrases, "greatest deal ever made," "total disaster," "historic failure," "like never before," the details, the mechanisms of policy, the impact on real lives all fall away. Citizens are left arguing over adjectives, not outcomes. In this way, language becomes not a tool of transparency but of obfuscation, a verbal smoke grenade. Furthermore, hyperbolic political language feeds into a culture of constant escalation. If one leader says they will respond strongly, the next must respond unimaginably strongly. The logic of diplomacy is replaced with the logic of playground bravado. Each rhetorical punch must be louder, faster, more decisive than the last. Soon, words are not being chosen for accuracy or appropriateness, but for their explosiveness. This style of communication relies heavily on the idea of exceptionalism. Leaders often position their own country, their own administration, their own voice as uniquely capable, uniquely powerful, uniquely righteous. Nobody's ever seen anything like this before. We're doing things no one else could even dream of. These phrases are designed to inflate egos, both the speakers and the audiences, while simultaneously dismissing all that came before. History is flattened, context is ignored, complexity is reduced to slogans. This hyperbole isn't limited to international threats or intergovernmental posturing. It seeps into domestic discourse as well. Policies are sold as game changers, once in a generation or revolutionary, regardless of their actual substance. Opposition is labelled the worst in history. Institutions are rigged. Processes are corrupt. Every day is treated as if it's on the brink of either utopia or apocalypse. This breeds a kind of emotional fatigue among the public, who are bombarded with high stakes, exaggerated rhetoric at all times, but rarely see the world change in proportion to the promises. Hyperbolic political language also amplifies division. When every political move is described in apocalyptic or salvific terms, compromise becomes betrayal and dialogue becomes weakness. Political opponents aren't just wrong, they're evil, dangerous, anti-freedom. This leaves little room for nuance or bridge building, and it erodes the foundational idea of democracy as a contest of ideas rather than a war of moral absolutes, despite the formal end of empires and the declarations of independence that echoed across the 20th century. The legacy of colonialism continues to haunt modern diplomacy like a ghost in the halls of every summit, trade, negotiation, and geopolitical standoff. The language, tone, and structure of many contemporary diplomatic exchanges still carry the residue of colonial hierarchies, where one voice booms with presumed authority and the other is expected to nod in strategic compliance. In the interactions between Western powers and formerly colonized nations, there is often a patronizing undertone that suggests a kind of civilizational superiority. Western leaders may couch their demands or criticisms in terms like guidance, partnership, or leadership, but the implication remains that certain nations are still learning how to behave, how to govern, or how to align themselves correctly in the international order. This subtle linguistic framing casts the West as the rational, enlightened teacher and the global South as the fumbling student, still under informal instruction. Trade agreements, security pacts, and development loans often come dressed in the language of mutual cooperation, but are underwritten by deeply unequal power dynamics. Conditionalities, pressure tactics, and performative diplomacy are not new inventions, they are merely new instruments playing the same old tune. When a powerful nation insists that another must take responsibility or face consequences for its domestic or regional decisions, it is not engaging in a dialogue of equals. It is echoing the authoritative tone of an imperial administrator reminding the colony of its place. Moreover, international institutions, many of which were established during or shortly after the colonial period, still reflect these imbalances. Voting structures in global bodies, access to financial systems, and even the locations of major decision-making forums privilege the historical powers while sidelining the voices of nations that were once subjugated. This isn't just a matter of geography or logistics, it's about who gets to set the agenda, define the terms, and interpret the rules. Cultural diplomacy also bears the stain of colonial legacy. Soft power tools like media, education, and entertainment continue to reinforce Eurocentric narratives, subtly positioning Western values as universal and others as particular or exotic. When Western media outlets cover political developments in non-Western nations, they often adopt a tone of bemused detachment, as if watching a chaotic experiment unfold in a petri dish rather than reporting on sovereign political processes. Even the language of sanctions and military intervention is deeply coloured by colonial memory. The notion that certain states must be corrected, reformed, or even saved by external force draws a straight line from the missionary and militaristic justifications of empire to modern doctrines of humanitarian intervention. The idea that some governments are too irrational, corrupt, or unstable to be trusted with their own autonomy echoes the colonial argument that native populations were incapable of self-rule. In these ways, modern diplomacy becomes a theatre in which old power dynamics are reenacted, albeit with new costumes and scripts. The choreography of meetings, the asymmetry of press conferences, the way aid is portrayed as benevolence rather than restitution, all of it reveals a structure that has been rebranded but not truly dismantled in the modern political arena. Power is no longer merely exercised, it is performed. Leaders do not simply govern, they act, they broadcast, they brand. The machinery of politics has become increasingly theatrical, where policy is secondary to posture, and decisions are framed less by strategy and more by spectacle. This is not accidental. It is a deliberate construction in which visibility, virality, and volume matter more than substance or sustainability. Contemporary power is filtered through a constant media lens. Television, social platforms, streaming services, and short-form content. The politician is now as much a character as a commander, crafted for consumption. They have slogans instead of philosophies, catchphrases in place of doctrines, and sound bites instead of speeches. They strike poses before podiums, throw scripted barbs at adversaries, and announce decisions as if delivering the climactic twist of a season finale. They are not solving, they are selling. This performative instinct flourishes especially in populist leaders, who rely on emotional resonance rather than legislative depth. Their gestures, be it pointing, pausing, tweeting, or storming into summits, are choreographed with the same precision as a theatre production. The goal is not to lead through quiet competence, but to be seen leading in a way that electrifies the base and dominates the narrative. The illusion of strength becomes more important than actual outcomes. Strength, after all, in this context, is an aesthetic. What emerges is a reality where the symbol becomes more potent than the act. A leader visiting a disaster site in military fatigues will garner more praise than one quietly streamlining emergency funds. Signing a giant, comically large executive order on live television creates more political capital than spending weeks negotiating a bipartisan bill. The political arena is reshaped to reward those who look like they are doing something, even if they are doing very little, or worse, doing harm. This performance of power is also deeply intertwined with ego. It demands applause, demands enemies, demands spectacle. There must always be a foe, be it immigrants, foreign nations, rival parties, or the media, against whom power can be projected. Without opposition, there is no stage. Without conflict, there is no script. Leaders cast themselves as embattled saviors, misunderstood geniuses, or misunderstood rebels, depending on the audience and the moment. Media, particularly commercial media, plays an enabling role in this performance. Outlets thrive on conflict, on drama, on characters who provoke outrage or adoration. As a result, serious deliberation gets less airtime than explosive statements. Policy gets buried under personality. Governance, once a process of deliberation and compromise, is reframed as a 24-hour live show, ratings dependent. This theatrical mode of leadership also demands spectacle in foreign policy. Grandstanding replaces negotiation. Military parades and defiant threats are broadcast like movie trailers. Announcements of sanctions or retaliations are made with rhetorical flair to reinforce an image of control and dominance. Power is no longer about strategic maneuvering behind closed doors. It is about performance before the world. The dynamic between East and West in global politics has long been shaped by tension, competition, and a heavy dose of historical irony. These two geopolitical blocs, though admittedly oversimplified terms, carry with them centuries of conflict, cultural divergence, and philosophical disagreement. And yet, in a world supposedly more connected than ever, the relationship remains deeply strained, marked by suspicion, misrepresentation, and a mutual obsession with superiority. Much of this tension is rooted in the West's colonial past and its enduring sense of centrality in global affairs. Western powers, particularly Europe and North America, still operate with the underlying assumption that they are the architects of modernity, guardians of liberal democracy, technological progress, and global governance. Meanwhile, the East, represented by countries like India, China, and others in Asia and the global South, has rapidly evolved into a region of economic dynamism, cultural resilience, and political assertiveness. The irony lies in how these old paradigms clash with new realities. The West, which once dictated terms to the East through empire and economic coercion, now finds itself economically dependent on Eastern manufacturing, labor, and markets. Supply chains for Western consumer goods run through Eastern factories. The chips in Western smartphones, the fabric in Western clothing, even the code behind Western software platforms often originate in the East. This interdependence creates a strange paradox, antagonism toward the very regions that sustain one's own economy. Another irony is found in the language of democracy and human rights. Western nations often position themselves as moral arbiters, issuing statements, sanctions, and condemnations when Eastern powers deviate from prescribed democratic norms. Yet these same Western nations grapple with their own internal crises: mass surveillance, populist movements, racial unrest, and corporate oligarchy. The East, in turn, is quick to point out these inconsistencies. When lectured on governance, leaders from the East increasingly respond not with deference, but with derision, highlighting the hypocrisy embedded in such critiques. There is also a cultural component to the tension. The West often frames its own values as universal individualism, secularism, free market capitalism, freedom of speech. Yet many Eastern traditions emphasize collectivism, spiritual pluralism, and a different sense of social harmony. Instead of celebrating this pluralism, Western discourse frequently casts it as backward or oppressive. Meanwhile, Eastern nations bristle at this reductionism and begin to reclaim their own narratives, their own identities, refusing to play supporting roles in someone else's story. Technological rivalry adds fuel to the fire. Battles over data, artificial intelligence, and digital infrastructure are not just about innovation, they are symbolic struggles for dominance in the next era of civilization. Whether it's 5G, space exploration, or social media platforms, both East and West are vying for ideological and technological influence, accusing each other of espionage, manipulation, and manipulation of global norms. Even cultural exports become battlegrounds. Hollywood and Bollywood, K-pop and American pop, fashion, cuisine, cinema, all carry subtle assertions of soft power. And while the West once exported culture effortlessly, it now finds its dominance challenged by Eastern creativity that refuses to mimic. Choosing instead to innovate on its own terms, politics no longer unfolds quietly in the halls of governance or behind closed doors. It is curated, amplified, and dissected across an endless stream of headlines, hashtags, and 24-hour news cycles. The media, in its insatiable appetite for the immediate and the sensational, has become not merely a chronicler of political events, but a co-author of political reality. In this environment, politics is no longer primarily about legislation or diplomacy, it is about spectacle. The bigger the drama, the better the engagement. The media doesn't just report on hysteria, it thrives on it. Conflict is more clickable than consensus, outrage more profitable than nuance. A policy speech filled with technical detail barely registers, but a 5-second clip of a leader shouting, insulting, or grandstanding becomes viral content. The architecture of news has been retrofitted for attention economics. Algorithms reward anger. Headlines scream, not speak. News anchors perform more than they inform, and politics, as a result, is shaped to suit the medium. This constant state of manufactured crisis creates a world in which everything is urgent, but almost nothing is important. A misstep on social media is treated with the same gravity as an economic meltdown. A diplomatic gesture is framed as a global insult. Political theatre, particularly when laced with hyperbole or controversy, takes precedence over real governance. The goal is no longer to do something, but to appear as if something monumental is always happening. Leaders have adapted accordingly. They now speak in tweets and sound bites, perform their outrage on camera, and stage their decisions with as much theatrical flair as possible. Press briefings become performances, rallies resemble rock concerts, announcements are teased like trailers, complete with pre-roll graphics and suspense, building pauses. The language of entertainment merges with the language of governance, until it becomes difficult to distinguish one from the other. The spectacle is not random, it is constructed. It is planned by teams of image consultants, media strategists, and communications experts. Optics, not outcomes, guide the decision-making process. Political survival now depends not only on competence, but on a constant ability to trend. Politicians are pressured to stay visible, to stir emotion, to keep their base emotionally activated, either by promises of salvation or threats of annihilation. This fusion of media and politics creates a warped sense of public participation. Citizens are turned into spectators, offered an endless stream of content that mimics involvement but rarely demands it. Watching a viral speech, liking a political meme, or retweeting a takedown of an opponent feels like engagement, but often replaces deeper civic action. The performance substitutes for the process. The hysteria drowns out the reality, and while the media claims to hold power to account, it also helps construct the very stage on which power is performed. It props up the drama, picks the villains, and rewards the most dramatic with airtime. Political complexity is flattened into good vs evil, crisis vs savior, outrage vs indifference. It is a world in which perception trumps truth and reality bends to the narrative that sells, in a world sliced up by imaginary lines and reinforced by passports, flags and anthems. The idea of humanity beyond borders can seem like a naive dream, yet beneath the geopolitical theatre, beyond the performances of power and the nationalist posturing, there remains something undeniable and inconvenient for every system of division. We are all fundamentally the same creature, wrestling with the same desires, needs and fears. Borders are useful for governments, for trade regulations, for tax codes, for defining where one authority ends and another begins. But they do not stop suffering. A famine does not respect a frontier. A pandemic does not consult a visa before spreading. Climate change is not deterred by customs officers. The consequences of war ripple beyond the country where it is fought, just as the exploitation of labour in one part of the world feeds the abundance of comfort in another. What happens over there is never really over there, it's here too, just delayed, diluted, or disguised. When a leader speaks about retaliation, supremacy, or nationalist pride, it is rarely the leader who suffers the outcome. It is the farmer, the factory worker, the child, the displaced family. It is the ordinary people who do not make decisions about bombs or sanctions, but who must live with the debris. Yet these people, the ones often most affected, are almost identical in every nation. Their lives revolve around the same rhythms, feeding their children, finding security, navigating community, clinging to dignity. Nationalism, while politically useful, often acts as a kind of collective amnesia. It invites people to forget that their lives are intricately connected with those of strangers across the globe. It sells the illusion of isolation in an era of deep interdependence. Global trade, digital communication, and environmental systems make it impossible to draw clean lines between us and them. Yet so much political rhetoric depends on reinforcing exactly that binary. And so, politicians perform enemies, create crises, and speak of threats, not because those things don't exist, but because they're easier to sell than solidarity. Yet, every now and then, reality breaks through the spectacle. A viral image of a child in a refugee camp, a storm that ravages cities across continents, a song sung in different languages with the same emotion. These moments reveal that the things which bind us are stronger than the things that divide us. They also expose the artificiality of the boundaries we hold so sacred. Culture, after all, travels, ideas migrate. Love does not check national IDs. Grief is not bound by borders. The irony is that as technology brings us closer together, the systems meant to govern us often pull us further apart. Surveillance is national. Regulation is national. But the internet, the atmosphere, the human imagination, these are borderless. The refugee fleeing war and the protester demanding rights are often speaking the same emotional language. Even if from opposite ends of the earth, the crisis of one region often mirrors the trauma of another. And still, the official discourse treats each nation as a sealed chamber, as if empathy has a shelf life and a citizenship requirement in a world ruled by performance, where power is acted more than exercised and rhetoric replaces responsibility. We must look beyond the noise. Hyperbole, spectacle, and colonial hangovers distort the real challenges we face, shared ones that do not stop at national borders. As East and West posture and media fans the flames, ordinary people remain caught in the fallout. But beneath the theatre lies our common thread: humanity. Beyond propaganda, beyond flags and slogans, we are more alike than different. And perhaps when the shouting stops, that quiet truth will be the reply like no other.